There is a particular vulnerability that authoritarian impulses reveal when they collide with the traditions of free expression that define democratic societies. When powerful individuals, accustomed to controlling narratives and managing criticism through intimidation or legal threat, attempt to silence satirists and comedians who mock them, the effort almost inevitably backfires in spectacular fashion. The attempt to censor becomes the story. The effort to suppress becomes the amplification. The power deployed to silence becomes the proof of exactly what the satire was criticizing in the first place. We are witnessing this dynamic play out in real time as reports emerge that the Trump administration attempted to pressure the network airing Stephen Colbert's late-night show to censor content critical of the president, only to have that censorship effort become a major news story precisely as the Department of Homeland Security, one of the administration's most critical agencies, descends into operational chaos following the Kristi Noem affair scandal. The timing of these two developments, the censorship effort and the DHS chaos, is not coincidental. They are symptoms of the same underlying disease, an administration that has lost the capacity to manage multiple crises simultaneously, that is lashing out in increasingly desperate and counterproductive ways, and that is watching its authority and effectiveness erode in real time as scandals compound, operations fail, and the normal tools of crisis management prove inadequate to contain the damage. The attempted censorship of Colbert reflects an administration that believes it can control criticism through intimidation. The chaos at DHS reflects an administration that has allowed personal scandal to paralyze a national security agency at a moment when it can least afford that paralysis. Together, they paint a portrait of governing failure that extends across policy areas and institutional boundaries. Stephen Colbert has been one of the most persistent and effective critics of Donald Trump throughout Trump's political career. His satirical commentary, delivered nightly to millions of viewers, has skewered Trump's policies, his personal conduct, his management style, and his relationship with truth in ways that have clearly gotten under the president's skin. Unlike news analysis or editorial commentary, satire has a particular power to undermine authority by making it appear ridiculous, by exposing the gap between grandiose claims and pathetic reality, by showing powerful people not as threats to be feared, but as fools to be laughed at. This is why authoritarians throughout history have been more threatened by comedians than by opposition politicians. You can negotiate with politicians. You can intimidate journalists. But satirists operate by different rules, and attempting to silence them often simply proves their point more effectively than anything they could say themselves. The specific content that apparently triggered the administration's censorship effort has not been fully disclosed, but sources indicate it involved a monologue segment that addressed the Epstein Files scandal, the exposure of survivor identities while perpetrator names were protected, and Attorney General Pam Bondi's refusal to acknowledge survivors during congressional testimony. Colbert's treatment of the subject was reportedly scathing, using his characteristic combination of humor and moral clarity to highlight the hypocrisy of an administration that claims to be tough on crime while apparently protecting powerful individuals connected to child sex trafficking. The segment resonated with viewers across the political spectrum because it addressed an issue where normal partisan divisions largely dissolved. Even Republicans have expressed outrage at the handling of the Epstein Files. The fact that Colbert was articulating what many Americans were already thinking and feeling made the administration's response particularly tone-deaf. The mechanism through which the censorship pressure was allegedly applied remains somewhat murky, as these things typically do when powerful actors want to influence media content without leaving clear fingerprints. But multiple sources describe a pattern of communications, from administration officials to network executives, communications that suggested consequences if certain content continued to air, that referenced regulatory authority over broadcast licenses, and that invoked the president's personal displeasure in ways designed to create pressure on the network to self-censor. This is how censorship typically works in systems that maintain a veneer of press freedom. direct government orders to suppress content are rare and legally fraught. Instead, pressure is applied through unofficial channels, through suggestions and implications, rather than explicit demands, creating an environment where media organizations are encouraged to police themselves rather than face regulatory retaliation or loss of access. What the administration apparently failed to anticipate is that in the modern media environment, attempts to pressure networks become stories themselves, often bigger stories than whatever content was being targeted. Journalists inside and outside the network who learned of the pressure campaign viewed it as newsworthy, both because it revealed administration priorities and because it raised fundamental questions about press freedom and the relationship between government power and satirical commentary. The story leaked, as such stories inevitably do in Washington, and suddenly the censorship effort became a major scandal in its own right, generating far more attention and criticism than the original Colbert segment would have received. The Streisand effect, named for Barbra Streisand's famously counterproductive attempt to suppress photographs of her home, played out exactly as media analysts could have predicted. The backfire was immediate and comprehensive. Other late-night hosts addressed the censorship attempt on their own shows, creating a unified front of satirical defiance that amplified the criticism rather than suppressing it. Colbert himself devoted significant airtime to the story, treating the administration's effort to silence him as validation of everything he had been saying about authoritarian tendencies and contempt for free expression. Media organizations that might not have covered the original segment extensively gave prominent attention to the censorship story. First Amendment advocates issued statements condemning government pressure on satirical commentary. And perhaps most damaging for the administration, the story created another news cycle dominated by negative coverage of their conduct, another day when they were playing defense, another example of self-inflicted wounds that competent crisis management should have prevented. While this media firestorm was erupting, the Department of Homeland Security was experiencing its own very different but equally serious crisis. The Kristi Noem affair scandal, which began with reports of an extramarital relationship during her time as governor and potentially continuing into her tenure as DHS secretary, has metastasized into a full-blown operational crisis that threatens the functioning of one of the government's most critical national security agencies. Noem's position has become increasingly untenable. Her refusal to acknowledge survivors during the Epstein hearing already damaged her credibility. Now, facing personal scandal on top of professional failures, she is reportedly unable to effectively lead an agency with over 200,000 employees and responsibility for everything from border security to counterterrorism to disaster response. The chaos at DHS manifests in multiple ways simultaneously. Senior officials are spending time managing the fallout from Noem's personal conduct rather than focusing on agency missions. Career staff morale has collapsed as employees watch their agency become synonymous with scandal rather than security. Congressional oversight has intensified, with both Republicans and Democrats demanding answers about Noem's vetting, about who knew what and when, and about whether there are security implications from the relationship. And critically, the operational capacity of the department is being compromised. When leadership is consumed by scandal, when authority is undermined, when attention is divided, the actual work of protecting the homeland suffers. Adversaries are watching, terrorists are watching, and they are seeing an agency in disarray. The connection between the Colbert censorship backfire and the DHS chaos is not merely coincidental timing. Both reflect an administration that has fundamentally lost control of its narrative and its operations. The attempt to censor Colbert suggests a White House that believes it can manage criticism through intimidation and control, a profoundly misguided assumption in a democracy with strong press freedom traditions. The chaos at DHS suggests an administration that prioritizes loyalty over competence in personnel decisions, that fails to properly vet appointees for vulnerabilities, and that allows personal scandals to paralyze critical government functions. These are not separate problems. They are manifestations of the same governance failures. The broader political implications are significant and still unfolding. Republicans who have defended the administration through multiple previous crises are finding the combination of censorship attempts and DHS chaos increasingly difficult to justify. The First Amendment issues raised by government pressure on satirical content resonate with conservative media figures who have their own concerns about censorship and who recognize that establishing a precedent for silencing critics could be used against them in the future. The spectacle of DHS in operational disarray over the personal conduct of its secretary undermines Republican messaging about national security competence and effective governance. And the fact that both crises are entirely self-inflicted, preventable through better judgment and more competent management, makes the defense even harder. Democrats are seizing the opportunity to argue that the administration has become so consumed by scandal management and crisis response that it has lost the capacity to govern effectively. The censorship attempt fits into a broader narrative about authoritarian tendencies and contempt for democratic norms. The DHS chaos validates concerns about the qualifications and judgment of administration appointees, and the combination reinforces the argument that this is not a government capable of handling the serious challenges facing the country, that it is instead lurching from self-inflicted crisis to self-inflicted crisis, with no apparent capacity to learn from mistakes or adjust course. The media environment surrounding these developments is itself part of the story. The censorship attempt has created a test case for how news organizations respond to government pressure. Networks and shows that might have been cautious about antagonizing an administration with regulatory power over their industries are instead doubling down on critical coverage, recognizing that capitulating to pressure would set a dangerous precedent, and that the public is watching to see whether press freedom will be defended in practice or merely proclaimed in theory. The solidarity among late-night hosts, typically competitors for audience and attention, demonstrates a recognition that threats to one satirist are threats to all, that allowing government censorship of comedy creates a permission structure that could eventually extend to all forms of media criticism. The international dimension should not be overlooked. American claims to support press freedom and democratic values are significantly undermined when the U.S. government itself attempts to censor satirical commentary about its conduct. Authoritarian regimes that the United States criticizes for suppressing dissent will point to the Colbert censorship attempt as evidence of American hypocrisy. Allied democracies that look to the United States as a model and partner will see the incident as another sign of democratic backsliding, and the combination of censorship attempts and operational chaos at a major national security agency projects an image of a government that is both authoritarian in impulse and incompetent in execution, precisely the worst combination from the perspective of international credibility. For DHS specifically, the path forward is genuinely unclear. Noem's position appears increasingly untenable. Calls for her resignation have intensified from both parties, but her departure would itself create another crisis, requiring a confirmation process for a replacement at a time when the agency desperately needs stability, and when the Senate may be reluctant to confirm another controversial Trump appointee. The alternative, having her remain in a position where her authority is fundamentally undermined and her ability to lead is severely compromised, is equally problematic. The agency needs functional leadership. It needs someone who can command respect from career staff, who can represent the department effectively to Congress and the public, and who can focus on mission rather than personal scandal management. The Colbert situation, meanwhile, has reached a point where the administration's options are all bad. They can continue applying pressure, which will only generate more negative coverage and more defiant satirical content. They can back off, which will be read as a humiliating retreat and an admission that the pressure was inappropriate. Or they can pretend the whole thing never happened, which is impossible given the level of media attention it has already received. There is no good option because the original decision to attempt censorship was fundamentally flawed. It assumed that power could be deployed to silence criticism without consequence. It assumed that networks would quietly comply rather than resist, and it assumed that in the modern media environment, such pressure could be applied secretly. All of those assumptions were wrong. The broader lesson about governmental overreach and the resilience of free expression traditions is one that should be obvious, but apparently needs to be relearned by each generation of would-be censors. In a democracy with strong constitutional protections for speech and a press that understands its role in holding power accountable, attempts to silence criticism typically fail and typically backfire. The mechanisms of that failure are well understood. Media organizations resist. Journalists investigate. The public reacts negatively to censorship, and the criticism that was targeted for suppression gets amplified rather than diminished. This pattern has played out countless times throughout American history. The fact that the current administration apparently believed they would be exempt from this pattern suggests either profound ignorance of history or dangerous arrogance about the extent of their power. For Stephen Colbert personally, the administration's attempt to censor him represents, in a perverse way, the highest compliment a satirist can receive from those in power. It confirms that his comedy is landing, that it is causing genuine discomfort, that it is reaching audiences and shaping perceptions in ways that threaten the administration's ability to control its narrative. Satirists want to be effective. They want to speak truth to power in ways that power cannot ignore. The attempt to silence them is validation that they are succeeding. Colbert will almost certainly use this episode as material for future segments. Meta-commentary about the attempt to silence, meta-commentary, creating layers of satirical critique that make the original censorship effort appear even more foolish in retrospect. The question that will ultimately determine the significance of these developments is whether there are meaningful consequences for the attempted censorship and whether the DHS chaos forces actual accountability and change. If the censorship attempt fades from public attention without any examination of who authorized it, who executed it, and whether similar pressure has been applied to other media organizations, the precedent will be established that such conduct is acceptable even if ineffective. If the DHS chaos continues indefinitely with no M remaining in position despite having lost the ability to lead effectively, the message will be that personal scandal and operational failure are insufficient to trigger accountability for administration appointees. But if there are genuine consequences, if the censorship effort generates sustained scrutiny and policy changes to prevent future attempts, if the DHS situation forces a leadership change and a reckoning about appointment standards, then these crises might actually produce some positive long-term effects. What is already clear is that the combination of these two stories, the censorship backfire and the DHS chaos, represents one of the more comprehensively bad weeks for the Trump administration in a presidency that has experienced many comprehensively bad weeks. The self-inflicted nature of both crises makes them particularly damaging. The fact that they happened simultaneously makes them mutually reinforcing in terms of narrative impact, and the absence of any clear path toward resolution for either situation suggests that the administration will be managing the fallout from these failures for weeks or months to come. In attempting to silence a comedian, they created a bigger story. In appointing a scandal-plagued secretary to a critical agency, they compromised national security. These are not the actions of a government that has mastered the art of strategic communication or competent personnel management. These are the actions of an administration that is, in multiple respects, and for multiple reasons, failing.